What's up everybody? I'm back with another video, and this week we're going to be going over the top 10 tips that I think every beginner reefer should know to get started with reefing in 2025. So let's jump right into number one, and that is choosing the right tank for you. There are so many options out there for different types of tanks, whether it be glass or acrylic, whether you want to do a all-in-one or a separate sump. There's tons of options, and I would urge you to do your research, talk to people who have different types of tanks, and get to know the ins and outs of each tank before you just jump into something, because you can always break down that tank and start a new one at that point, but you're going to start all over in terms of the process of cycling the tank and going through all the necessary steps to start your reef tank up again. One thing I will note when it comes to tanks is there are tons of options when it comes to used equipment, including the actual tank itself and things like lights, pumps, etc. There's so many options of used gear that is slightly used, not worn out. You can go on Facebook Marketplace, eBay, there's multiple places that you can go, your local fish shop even, and they'll have used options that are a fraction of the cost and really haven't been used too much, to the point where you could still get another couple years out of them. Additionally, the only things that I would say I would always buy new, things like heaters, refractometers, and other equipment that's relatively inexpensive but is extremely important to your tank's health. And you don't want things like that failing or being defective on you, because it could spell disaster for your tank. Now jumping into number two, that is choose the right equipment for your tank. Again, this is going to lead me into a very common theme of this video, and that is do your own research. I would thoroughly look into all the different options out there that you have in terms of the lights for your tank, different types of pumps, controllers, dosing systems. There's so many different options out there for you, and you'd be surprised at how different all of them can be. What's good for me might not be the best thing for you. So I would implore you to look at all of your options and talk to as many people as possible to get a full understanding of what you're about to buy. Again though, I would not rely on technology too much when it comes to your reef tank until you have a basic understanding of how your tank works, because once something goes wrong, you're not going to know how to fix it. So again, learn the basics and then build off of that. Alright, so this leads me into number three, and that is choose your rock and your substrate. I'm not even going to mention doing a bare bottom tank, just because of the fact that it's not really ideal for beginners, because it's very hard to get the tank up and running. It's easier to maintain once you get it up and running, but that initial startup can be very challenging, and I would not advise beginners to go that route, just because you're more likely to fail, and I don't want you guys wasting time, money, or killing any of the animals in your tank. So I would start out with rock and substrate as your first tank. Now there's multiple options when it comes to rocks in your tank. You can buy live rock that comes directly from the ocean. You can buy dry rock, which takes longer to cycle because there's no bacteria or other animals, invertebrates, or things living in the rocks to get your tank started. Or you can get rock from like your local fish shop or a friend who might be willing to give you some of their rock. Again, I would do your research into what comes with choosing each option. That way you can know what to expect once you get started and know what some of the common pitfalls are when people are starting up their tanks with the different types of rocks. In terms of sand, it's really up to you what kind of sand you want to go with. I personally would go with something a little bit of a thicker grain instead of something that's very thin. When you start having pumps blowing water around, you'd want something that's going to stay put rather than start to kick up once you get the flow going in your tank. Oh, and I forgot, one other thing with rocks. As I was looking at my notes, I just remembered this because I was having this issue, and that is make sure you cement or glue or whatever you need to do to make your structure permanent because I can't tell you how many times I've seen on social media somebody's rocks fell in the middle of the night, hit the side of the tank, again, a glass tank, and ended up cracking the glass, and they wake up to a floor full of water and dead fish. So I personally would cement my rocks down. I've done that in my tank because I don't want my structure moving. Then you'd risk killing corals or breaking the glass or a whole host of other issues. So I would make your structure permanent. Alright, this leads me into number 4, and that is research and plan your livestock. In our reef tank, we currently have just 2 clownfish and a pistol shrimp. At one point though, we did have a peppermint shrimp, a cleaner shrimp, and a dotty back. And if anybody here has dotty backs, they will probably say they're more aggressive than they thought. And that's how we felt when we got the dotty back, because at one point the dotty back started picking on all of the shrimp to the point of death. We had to kind of plan according to that, because then we realized how aggressive the dotty back had become, and we knew that we couldn't put anything else in the tank in terms of fish or other invertebrates that it could pick on. And so looking back at it, I probably wouldn't have put the dotty back in there, just because of the fact that we're limited on what fish we could put in there at that point. Now, when we moved from the apartment to the house that we're in now, I divided the fish, the water, the corals, everything into separate buckets. And unfortunately, in the move, one of the rocks, again, why I would make your structures permanent, tipped over and crushed the dotty back on the way to the house. And so we don't have the dotty back anymore, but now we have the 2 clownfish, and we're thinking about getting some new fish, which this will be a good chance for you to hit that subscribe button, because we're going to be getting new fish in our reef tank in the next couple weeks, and so I don't want you guys to miss that. So hit that subscribe button so you don't miss an upload in the future. But now that we don't have the dotty back, now we have some more options in terms of what we can put in our tank. So that was a long discussion, but it serves its point in telling you that you should pick your fish especially wisely, and your corals for that matter too, because they can sting each other and things like that. So, choosing their placement is important, but especially with fish, picking what fish you want to put in first versus last is extremely important, because there's a pecking order. And if you put certain fish in first and certain fish in last, there can be some issues with compatibility. The other thing underneath this point is, don't be afraid to start with beginner corals and fish for that matter, because people think that you gotta go straight to the most expensive coral or the most expensive fish or the hardest to take care of fish or coral. And for some people that may work, but for an overwhelming majority of people, that's gonna basically ruin their love for the hobby, and most likely will push you out of the hobby because you just wasted a ton of money and killed a bunch of fish and coral. And I would personally start with beginner fish or corals, because it's important to get a win under your belt and get your confidence up and build off of that, rather than having, a massive livestock loss right off the bat. Because at that point, losing a $300 fish, that can be pretty devastating, and it'll make you want to not do the hobby at all. So again, make sure you research your livestock and what you're actually going to put in your tank ahead of time before you start buying stuff. Now we're going to jump into number 5, which is perfect your process of maintaining water chemistry. Your water chemistry is extremely important to your tank, and a lot of people will actually say, we're not keepers of fish or corals, we're actually keepers of water. And to be honest, that's 100% true. As reefers, we're taking care of the water and what that provides to the corals, rather than us directly influencing the fish or the corals. If we give them bad water, they're not going to do well, whereas if we give them everything that they need, there's no reason why they won't do well. Especially as new reefers, it's extremely important to start measuring your water to know what's actually in your water. Things like nitrates, phosphate, salinity, all those parameters are extremely important. especially if you want to grow in this hobby and grow expensive corals. You want to actually know what's in your water. That way, if something goes wrong, you can diagnose the issue very early on, rather than as the coral's dying, you're trying to still figure out what's going on. What? Hello. Hi. Do you want to say hi to the camera? Okay. Thank you. Yes. Okay. All right. So what I'll finish up with this point is find a schedule that works for you in terms of how you want to monitor all the parameters in your tank and stick with that. That way you can know when something's going wrong and address it in a timely manner. Alright, so on to number 6, and that is master your reef lighting. There are so many options out there when it comes to reef lighting in terms of all the different cool features that there are, the programmability of them, and how much you can adjust them. It usually applies more to corals than it does to fish-only tanks, but you want to make sure that you're having some form of measuring your PAR in your tank when it comes to corals, because you want to make sure that you're giving them the amount of light that they need and not too much or too little. And again, I would slowly start to increase your lighting or decrease your lighting. That way you're not making huge swings, which will again negatively affect your corals. Currently right now I'm using an AI Hydra 32 over my 24-gallon reef tank, and I used the Viper Spectra in the past. Both of them have adjustments that allow you to adjust the blue and the white light independently. But with the AI Hydra 32, you get a little bit more programmability, which I absolutely love. There's tons of features on it, and I wish I would have jumped to that light first rather than buying the one that I did just because it was cheaper. But nonetheless, both of them will grow coral. One might just do a little bit better. Now, on to number 7, and that is make sure that you're paying attention to how much you're feeding. One of the most common issues with beginner reefers is that they overfeed. I personally have done this way too many times where I start putting food into the tank, I forget to turn the pumps off, the food's blowing around the tank, some of it's hitting the rocks, some of it's hitting the floor and the sand, and my fish are just kind of picking at whatever comes past them, but a lot of it goes uneaten. Now the flow in your tank should be directing all those uneaten food particles up into the overflow and into your protein skimmer and your other methods of filtration, but not all of it's going to be caught up in that, and you're going to have breakdown inside your tank. And that will cause your nitrates to go up as well as your phosphates, and those are not good for fish or corals. My rule of thumb when it comes to feeding is I do it very slowly. I make sure the fish are eating each piece that I put in, and once they start picking at a couple pieces here and there and leaving the other ones, I stop feeding. Now when it comes to feeding your corals, I would really try and focus on doing it sparingly at the beginning. Foods like Reefroids and Red Sea AB Plus are good options for feeding your corals, but overusing these types of foods can actually raise your phosphates very high as well as your nitrates. And so I would advise you to start using these coral foods very sparingly at the beginning, seeing how it affects your tank, and then building off of that. Most corals are going to get what they need in terms of energy from your lights. So feeding corals is not necessarily a necessity, but it can spur on growth quicker than if you're just using lights. Now on the topic of overfeeding, this leads me into my next point, which is number 8, maintain your filtration systems. As a beginner reefer, I think it's extremely important to get to know your tank very well and understand when equipment isn't operating properly or when it needs to be cleaned. Maintaining filtration systems in your tank is extremely important to preventing any type of nutrient spikes within your tank, and it also helps provide a clean and balanced environment within your reef tank. I myself have fallen victim to this because I've gotten busy in life, and as a result my tank maintenance had decreased and algae started to take over my tank because my filters and my protein skimmer were not optimally running, and as a result my nutrients had spiked, causing huge algae outbreaks. So if you want to avoid any unnecessary algae, I would make sure you maintain your filtration very well. Now on to number 9, which is along the same lines as number 8, and that is regular tank maintenance. I can't tell you how many times I've been taking care of my tank, whether it be scrubbing the glass or cleaning out the protein skimmer or just looking at things in the tank and saw something was just completely wrong with a coral or my fish were acting really weird, and then I realized there was something that I needed to address and or fix. As a beginner reefer, I think it's extremely important to just get used to looking at things in your tank, because a lot of the issues that happen in reef tanks happen over time, not just a matter of minutes. So looking at your reef tank and kind of seeing things evolve and change for the worse will allow you to make a decision earlier on rather than when it's too late. Additionally, in 2025, we have so many options when it comes to technology in terms of auto top-off systems, auto water change systems, and many other forms of technology that help maintain our tank on a regular basis. But what I will say is that a water change is always going to be the key to reversing any issues. Almost anything that goes wrong in a reef tank can be reversed or at least mitigated with a water change. I typically stick to a water change every week of around 10 to 20% of my water, and I do it every single week, usually on the same day depending on what I have going on. Again, consistency is going to be the key with anything that you do in your reef tank, so I always try to stick to 7 to 8 days is when I do my water change. Now there are other ways to maintain your tank that don't require you to do consistent water changes and things like that, but I will leave those for the experienced reefers because even they will mess things up with that. So I do not advise beginner reefers to go into methods like the moonshiner's method or other methods of maintaining your tank on a weekly basis. And now number 10, what I would say is the most important skill to learn in reefing, and that is patience. Nothing in a reef tank happens quickly, and I think early on as a beginner reefer you see all of the other reefers' tanks just absolutely exploding in growth or taking care of so many different fish, and from a standpoint that I was in, I started to get jealous of all the other people within the hobby because I saw how well they were doing, and I was looking at my tank and I was like, I have tons of algae, I have zero coral growth, I'm struggling to just keep my fish alive, and because of that I started to make a lot of changes very quickly and I couldn't really predict what was going to happen in my reef tank. And if anything, it seemed to cause more issues than if I would have just remained patient and taken things slowly and one day at a time rather than trying to make a bunch of changes all at one time. I probably would have been more successful early on. I strongly urge you to just take things very slow. Do not rush things, because when you start to rush, things will go wrong. And just take your time and enjoy the hobby and enjoy the process of learning about your tank rather than just chasing absolute fastest growth and sticking as many fish into your tank as possible. You'll save a lot of money, you'll save a lot of headaches, and you'll stay in the hobby a lot longer than someone who rushes everything. So there you have it, 10 easy steps that you can follow as a beginner reefer to get started on the right foot. I appreciate it if you stuck around this long for the video. As I'm just starting out, I would really appreciate it if you hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on your bell so you never miss a future upload. I'll be posting videos every week, whether it be a video about my tank or more things that I can share with you guys to help you guys out in the hobby. If there's something that you want to see a video on or you want to learn more about, drop it down in the comments below. Otherwise, happy reefing.